The story you are about to hear is true.
Rania Abouzeid is a Lebanese Australian independent journalist who has extensively covered the war in Syria. As a journalist with more than 2 decades of experience in the Middle East, she knows the history of the region, how it impacts current events, and how social and cultural conditions shape today's news. Born in New Zealand and raised in Australia, she is the daughter of Lebanese immigrants. She traveled to Beirut during its civil war for family vacations, and even in war found there was life in Beirut.
My name is Rania Abouzeid. I was born in Wellington, New Zealand, and I grew up between New Zealand and Australia, and I'm Lebanese Australian.
Okay. What was it like growing up with the name Abouzeid?
It was difficult because it was an odd name. It was difficult to pronounce. My surname wasn't Smith. I wasn't blonde. I didn't have blue eyes. So it was like externally, I didn't really fit in, but internally I felt that I did. And I think that is the dilemma of the migrant child growing up in the new world, trying to reconcile the two parts of yourself.
Did your parents live in a Lebanese way in Australia? Were you more in a community, or were you just integrated with everybody else?
No, we actually avoided the Lebanese community because the Lebanese community in Australia was based on, it's almost like they took their prejudices and they transplanted them in their new home. The associations were associations based on religious affiliation or political parties, and we wanted none of that. So we grew up, if you like, in a Lebanese home, but very. We grew up in the Lebanon of Fayrouz and Wadi al-Safi. We didn't grow up in the Lebanon of sects and political parties.
And what was your relationship with Lebanon while you were growing up?
My maternal grandparents were living here during the war, so everything that was happening to Lebanon during the 70s and 80s was very real in our house. It was something tangible. Politics was not a theory. It meant the difference between whether or not my grandparents were safe. And we followed the news very closely as you could in the 70s and 80s when there was, no Facebook and no Twitter and no instant news. But we followed it very carefully because it had such a real meaning for us. So I grew up knowing that I was Lebanese and also knowing that I was Australian.
During those times, I assume you weren't coming back for the summer holidays like many Lebanese kids did. What was your relationship with your grandparents? Were they important in your life?
I remember my mother would write letters to her parents, and they would take sometimes months to arrive. And she would trace my hand on a piece of paper and say, "This is Rania's hand, she's 5. This is Rania's hand, she's 7. And I was 10 years old before my parents saw me the first time that I came to Lebanon in the middle of the Civil War. And we came for a number of trips after that. And my Lebanon at that time wasn't simply the Lebanon that you'd read about in the newspapers about people killing each other. My Lebanon was a Lebanon of olive groves and pomegranate trees and almond trees and being able to play all day in a village and not having to check back in with my parents. That was also part of my Lebanon that existed and that coexisted in the middle of this very ugly war. And I remember, that's actually one of the reasons why I became a journalist, because I could see that the Lebanon I was reading about wasn't necessarily my grandparents' Lebanon. And I could see that there was more to it, and that there is always life in war. And I wanted to be somebody who could see all parts of an issue.
It's been said that the Lebanese people mark war on a timeline, and they talk before and after. What do you think of this?
I think it's true, and it's not just the Lebanese people. I see the Syrians doing the same thing now. I've been covering Syria for many years. The Iraqis did the same thing too. I think it is a function of war, that is not specific to the Lebanese people, but merely to the event itself.
Can we speak about a Lebanese culture? Is there a Lebanese culture?
I think there is. I think there are Lebanese cultures, especially these days, but I think that there is a baseline sort of Lebanese culture, most definitely. It's one of hospitality, it is one of certain stories about this place, about, like I said, the Lebanon of Beirut, the Lebanon of Wadi al-Safi, which might be a little bit romantic, and it may never have actually existed across the board, if you like, countrywide, but it certainly did in some places.
You know, the Lebanese seem to be in love with this myth, sometimes even more so than they are with the present. What is it?
Because it was simpler. Because it was peaceful. Because it is a myth that perhaps speaks to the better part of us, as opposed to some of the ugly realities that we see now, and the hate-filled reality about what happened after the myth, during the war, and what came after the war, this generation that grew up in war and that was raised on violence.
And how do you see that with the next generation on, which is today's generation? Are they still carrying that, or are they reacting to that, or have they gone beyond that?
I don't know. It's difficult. It's a little bit difficult to generalize because, Lebanon to me now just seems so atomized in terms of its various communities. It is, you have an entire generation that grew up fearing the other or hearing the stories of their parents about areas that they couldn't go to, about people that they didn't want to bump into in dark alleyways and things like that. And I think that does leave a residual effect that may or may not be manifested. But I think that there is that, that's the soil that some people grew up in.
And you go around Beirut, and anywhere you go, you see beautiful buildings sandwiched in between buildings that still show signs of war. Is that a part of that too? You have the physical memory everywhere you go.
I think you need the physical memory. I think that we need to remember what we did to each other, and that erasing it without addressing the underlying problems, I think, is a problem. And it is something that I think the Lebanese haven't adequately addressed.
What's your favorite memory as a child related to Lebanon, your family? Or what's a memory, an anecdote that sticks with you?
Oh my, so many.
We have time for all of them.
I don't know, I mean, I grew up in a place where my parents were always terrified of, letting me out of their sights. They were, if I wanted to go to the corner store, I'd have to ask permission, and I'd have to be back at a certain time, and they'd be worried that, I might be, I don't know, snatched by a pedophile or something like this. And I remember being in my mother's village and just roaming from morning till night, and everybody knew who I was, and I felt very safe. And people knew who I was. They knew that I was so-and-so's granddaughter. And that sense of belonging, of community, of not having to worry was something that sticks with me.
Okay, that relationship with the ancestral village seems to be very important and has been very present. Is that changing? Well, first, is that true? Is that a myth? And is that changing?
For me personally, or for the Lebanese?
For you, and then the Lebanese in general.
No, I mean, for me, it was more of a childhood thing. It hasn't continued into the present.
Mm-hmm. And for the Lebanese in general, are they losing their contact with the villages? Is there being more children working in Beirut and not going back for the summers, or is that connection still there?
I think it is, that connection is forced on you, even if you don't want it to be, because at every point in your life, you must, if you want to vote, you have to go back to where your family is from, not where you're living, not your place of residence, but the place where you come from. So that connection is difficult to be severed in a real way. I mean, practically, you don't have to go up to the village, but in terms of officially and getting things done, that connection persists.
Does that connection have value in the development of Lebanese, or is that something whose time has passed?
We have a saying that if you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going. And if you don't acknowledge where you come from, you know, those without a past have no future. And this is something that is not just Lebanese, it's region-wide, you know. I mean, if you want to insult somebody, you tell them that they have no past. That's the insult. Because this is a place where family and who you are is very important.
Lebanon is a small country surrounded by neighbors. How does that impact? First, the culture. Obviously, politically, geopolitically, there's a lot. But the culture itself, how does this being situated among all these neighbors affect the culture, do you think?
Well, you know, Lebanon has long been divided between those who think that this place is really a part of Syria and those who say, no, it is a distinct country with its own unique heritage and history. So this is, you know, a divide that speaks to the very essence of what this place is. And the Lebanese haven't reconciled sort of their understanding of whether this is in fact part of Greater Syria, as some suggest, or whether it isn't a separate entity.
Food. Let's turn to food for a second. I like that subject anyways.
Let's.
It's an obvious question, but I'll ask it anyways for people that don't know. How important is food to this culture?
Food is central. Food is key. Food means the family sitting around a table. Food is memory. Food is history. Food is culture. Food is sustenance. It's everything. And Lebanese food is very difficult to prepare. It takes time. So it's not something that you sort of slap together and off you go. It's on the table in 5 minutes. There's a love that sort of goes into preparation of a meal. And it's never a one-dish meal. There's always a mix of different things on the table.
Food, abundance, and status. We've seen around that the Lebanese people also like to show their success and things like that. Is the table a part of that, or is it really what you also is showing abundance, or what's the role?
It's about, I think, a generosity of spirit as well, especially with guests. You have to show abundance. You have to, you know, treat a guest in a manner that befits him or her, and this is a matter of pride.
Let's talk about giving. You work a lot with, or you have worked a lot with the refugees, and how are the Lebanese with relationship to supporting their own people and other people? Are they generous people?
I think that the Lebanese civil war fundamentally broke something in Lebanon that hasn't been restored yet. And I know from my parents, who left way before the war, and my grandparents before them, that it changed society. It changed, it hardened people, and I think that we're still seeing the remnants of that. I look at the Syrians, you know, I've covered Syria now for 4 years, and I see what I think the Lebanese were like before their own civil war. And it changed society. It made it harder, meaner, more selfish, more individualistic, because people had to survive. If you know, you'll hear a lot of people who lived through the war. Some of my relatives say that things were actually better during the war because people in a particular building or in a particular neighborhood had to band together because they had to survive. So there was a generosity of spirit there. But that after the war, it became a very selfish place. And that's something that you'll hear across Beirut and into the villages. And that's something that I find very interesting, especially when I look at the Syrians who are going through their own horrific civil catastrophe. And I wonder what will become of their culture, of their state, of their community, if and when they emerge on the other side of this thing.
Some have said that one of the reasons, it's a bit what you came back to, is that they need challenge. They need things to overcome, and then that emigration or war is what feeds them that challenge.
Well, this is a, you know, this is a small space, and from, you know, the days of the Phoenicians, the Lebanese, or those who became, our forebears, if you like, went out into the world. And so we have a very long tradition of people from this, patch of earth going out into the world and trying to make something of themselves. And of course, instability exports its children. And this is a very unstable place, and it has been for a very long time. So,
is it an egocentric culture individually, or is that something it's become?
I think it has become that. And I think that it's one of the remnants of the war, the post-war period.
What is your favorite Lebanese dish?
Tabouleh. It's cliche, but it's tabouleh.
And who makes the best tabouleh?
Oh, my mom.
Yeah, I found kibbeh tabouleh. It's only the mother.
It has to be. I think Lebanon is a land of contradictions. It wants to be ultra-modern, and yet it also clings to that past that you're talking to. And there are also many Lebanons. There is not just one. You have the Lebanon of Beirut in some villages, and you have the ultra-modern, ultra-Western Lebanon of plastic surgery and, shiny facades as well. You have that too. You have, these Lebanons at the moment coexist uneasily in some places. So you have lots of different Lebanons, but I think that it would be a great tragedy. And it always saddens me when you see Lebanese who don't want to speak their language, for example, or who, are rushing to sort of, put on, I liken it to a 70-year-old man who wants to wear the clothes of a toddler. They just don't fit, and you're better than that. You have passed that stage. You have a rich and a storied history. So why cast that aside and in the name of trying to be ultra modern by borrowing from other cultures? I mean, you can borrow and you can meld, but don't forget who you are. And I think that unfortunately in Lebanon there is a tendency among some, certainly not all, to try and forget who we are, forget what it is about this place that makes it this place.
When you speak about, speak your language, which language is it?
Arabic, she says in English.
Arabic, she says in English. And yet, what does that say to the Phoenician history? Does it cancel it?
I don't think it cancels it. I think that Lebanese culture has taken something from every conqueror that passed through this narrow strip of land. We are a part of all of those cultures, and that is what makes us Lebanese.
In fact, is this a culture of inclusion? Is Lebanon, is that really what the culture is? Is that it's able to include so many different things as opposed to having one specific linear identity?
I don't think that we've ever had one specific linear identity because, there are some Lebanese who say that they're not Arabs. And there are others who say that, we are. There are some who think we're part of Greater Syria, others who say we are a distinct entity. So I don't think we've ever really had one linear sort of history. In fact, we don't even have a history book that can an official history book that can refer to events from 1975 on, because those events are in dispute. So that's a key thing about looking at our past. But I do think that we are a mix of all of the various different cultures that pass through here, and we have absorbed some elements of all of those different things. But there is still something in my mind that I think is uniquely Lebanese, and it's not just the tabouleh and the accent. I think there is something else. I think that it is the myth, as you put it, that Fayrouz referred to. It is the myth that Wadi' al-Safi sang about. It is also the myth that Khalil Gibran recalled longingly when he was in the diaspora.
You're a woman in Lebanon doing a very serious job. When you started this, did you feel any of the pressure that many other women we've talked to get? That it's like, fine, do that, but when are you going to get married and have kids? Or what problems have you experienced is the more fair question, if any.
I'm a journalist. I'm not a female journalist in the sense that my gender, I don't think, comes into it. It has, sometimes when I deal with ultra-conservative Islamists, it's harder, but I still deal with them. So I don't dwell on things like that. I dwell on sort of getting the job done.
And I actually mean from the other side, not from the people you meet, but from family, from community, people like that. Have you felt supported in everything you're doing, or have you ever had some confusion? What are your thoughts on it?
No, I mean, my family regret what they say is my reverse migration, because it's so dangerous and because it's so scary to them, and I can completely understand that. So it's more from that perspective rather than because I'm a female and I should take a particular route. I grew up in a family of where that wasn't an issue. We were told that we could do whatever we wanted if we worked hard and got good grades and all the rest of it. And gender was never an obstacle. It was never presented as such.
Let's talk about reverse migration. Why is it that the Lebanese overseas, who seem to have a real issue with this, they stay Lebanese over there, and yet, at least for my father, the concept of going back was to cancel everything he'd done.
Interesting, because that wasn't the case with my family. We, my parents were always waiting for a lull in the fighting. We grew up thinking that our stay was going to be temporary. It was only until the war ended. As soon as the war ended, we'd be back. And my father, who'd been gone since the 60s, and his family that had been gone since the 1890s, actually, some elements of them, they'd been gone a long time, and yet there was still this draw to come back here. And when the war did end, my father returned to a country he didn't recognize, and one that he didn't want to be a part of, at least here, because all of those things that he had taken with him, if you like, that had been almost frozen in time, his Lebanon was frozen in time. And of course, that wasn't the real Lebanon that existed. And he couldn't find himself in the new one. And he chose not to. He wanted to live in that one that was frozen in his memory.
And why is it so hard for the rest of the world to see Lebanon? We see the countries around us, and they seem to be well known, but why is it so hard to see Lebanon for what it is?
Yeah, I mean, if you recall, if you're old enough to remember the 80s, you remember that Lebanon was synonymous with the war. And, even now in popular culture, you'll still hear things like, some bombing site looks like Beirut. But do you know what Beirut looks like now? It's shiny. It has elegant cobblestone streets. It's bustling. There are pockmarked buildings, to be sure, but there's a lot more. So constantly viewing this place through the prism of a war that ended decades ago isn't doing it any justice, because that Lebanon is also frozen in time in some ways. It exists in another era. We have the remnants of it, which continue into the present day, but that is not all that this place is. And it seems like, some people just aren't prepared to move on from that, from viewing it through that prism. I mean, you still read articles that refer to how, young people in a nightclub have no recollection about the Civil War. Why should they? It ended before they were born. So, this place is a lot more than just its recent ugly past.
Do you think the Lebanese overseas community has a hand in that too? I find many of them are afraid from their experiences, and in fact, when I come over, they seem to be more afraid than the situation requires in this moment. Are we reinforcing this idea?
Well, if I just look at my parents' friends, the ones who migrated at the same time as they did, there are some of them who never came back, who didn't teach their children Arabic, who wanted nothing to do with their past. They made a complete cut. And then there are others, like my parents, who maintained an association with this place. And they would come back, so they knew what it was like. And then there is another class yet. There is another class as well, where they sort of wanted to maintain some kind of association, didn't come back, but still have that fear that you speak of. So there are lots of different subsets within the Lebanese diaspora.
When my father left, which was in '54, he left before the issues. You left for an education, you left for business, but he taught us French, because in those days, if you wanted to get somewhere, you had to be French. There seems to be a schism both here and overseas between what you're talking about, the Lebanese who speak their language, who have their language, and the others who believe to be Lebanese but come from another time or another background. How do we heal this?
I mean, speaking other languages isn't a bad thing. I'm just saying that recognize what your primary one is. Knowledge is always, more knowledge is always better. But don't deny what your baseline is. Don't deny what your essence is. I mean, I remember growing up in Australia, and there was a period where I'd watch the news, and there were the only references to Lebanon were about the war. This was in the 80s, and there were ugly images on the TV of people killing each other. And I decided I wasn't Lebanese anymore. I came home from school, I was in primary school, and I told my dad, that's it, I'm not Lebanese anymore, I'm only Australian, and why'd you give me this difficult name? And my father said, yes, we are Australian, but we have much deeper roots in a much older place, and we were not always like this. And I remember he went and got me one of these glossy coffee table books that he had around the house. And he opened it up to the pages about the cedars of Lebanon that were used in King Solomon's temple, and the alphabet and things like that. And he said, this is who we once were. We are more than just the news that's on the TV. And that stuck with me, and I still carry that with me.
There are a lot of people in this world, and we're still dealing with this today when we talk about Palestinians and giving them territory, that say, well, you just made Lebanon 50 years ago, so split it up. What's the difference? It makes no difference.
Lines on the ground are one thing, and a cultural history belonging to a people that lived on this strip of territory is something else. The Western powers may have, sat around a table and put lines on a map, but this place existed well beyond that. If you look at the old texts, if you look at the ancient philosophers, if you look at the ancient religious manuscripts and things like that, there is a history of a place called Lebanon here, and it dates back millennia. I think it's less about culture than it is about politics and sectarianism, and they're the sort of main factors when it comes to the Palestinians and the Syrians. This is a country that has long been divided along pro and anti Assad lines, and so this is a place with a very long history of involvement with Syria, which some people see as a positive involvement and others see as a negative involvement. And there's a lot of pain in that relationship. And so that's our baseline. And then into that baseline, more than 1 million Syrians have now sort of flooded into a country of only about 4 million people. So it's a very dangerous mix at the moment. Very tense.
I guess the question is it too much to integrate, or is there a breaking point here when you have such massive groups?
I think unfortunately there is a breaking point, and for many people they are astounded because we haven't reached it yet. I mean, Lebanon has absorbed more refugees per capita than I think any other place in the Middle East.
Looking at what you said about the culture of war and how that impacts everything, I'm looking at the new traffic laws and the fact that we're using incredible military roadblocks to check seat belts and things like that. Is there a nature, because of this, of just you automatically go to this mechanism in everything you do, even when it's just public, civil?
Well, the thing about Lebanon is that the army almost serves as a police force, in this place, so it's not unusual. That's something that tourists might be struck by, the fact that you can find a tank parked near the beach. It's it's just like a police car. You know, it's just like being in the U.S. somewhere and having a police car patrolling the beach. We have tanks. It's the same sort of thing. It's almost it becomes so common that it almost fades into the background in some ways. You don't really see that kind of disconnect between why there's a guy in full military fatigues carrying a rifle standing at a checkpoint, as opposed to what you'd expect in some other places, and just simply a policeman standing there enforcing a traffic rule. Although, having said that, the army doesn't in fact enforce that, but it's the paramilitary gendarmerie. You know, Lebanon is always viewed as a place of extremes. You know, if you look at the media or what have you, where either, you know, this hedonistic island in the middle of a conservative region, or we're on the brink of war or at war. But it's the reality is obviously more nuanced than that, and that is something that often gets lost. We do have those extremes, but we are also what's in the middle. That's daily life. The extremes are extremes. They exist on the peripheries. And you know, the tank that you're talking about, that your relatives might see and be afraid of, to some other people it's reassuring. It's a sign of, you know, security. So it all depends on your perspective as well. Things look different to different people based on their own experience. Obviously, to somebody in the US, a tank parked somewhere isn't normal. To somebody here, it might be, and it might actually be a sign of increased security rather than increased threat.
From 2014 through 2016, I traveled throughout Lebanon for the film Finding My Lebanon. From interviews with journalists, cultural icons, visionaries, and artists, I came to understand a society that few can define. A culture of uniqueness that shuns xenophobia, a desire to enjoy the moment, regardless of the political and economic realities of that moment. These are the Lebanon tapes, the complete, unedited interviews from that time. I'm Mark Abouzeid, and these are the Lebanon tapes. To watch other episodes or other films by Real Lives, please log in to YouTube's channel, reallives.ngo.